In last week's video, we quilted the center of our mandala quilt, and now we're going to build off it to add even more detail to our beautiful quilt. I'm Angela Walters, and welcome to the second video in the Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along Mandalas. In this free video series, we're working through this mandala panel that I designed exclusively for the videos. We're not only learning how to work our way through the quilt, I'm showing you some different design variations and demonstrating how to quilt it on a sewing machine and a long arm. In this week's video, we're going to be focusing on the areas in this part of our mandala with the pretty little pink and the corally red colors. And we're going to talk about how to use echoing to make areas a little bit easier to quilt, and how to add some pops of texture with designs that you might normally think of for sashing. It's going to be a ton of fun. So let's get to it. All right, so let's get to quilting our panel. And I'm going to start working in these orange portions, working my way back out. I'm going to add a little bit of echoing just to give it a bit of detail. But it's actually going to be a nice curved line that's going to go from point to point. I'm going to use my Taj ruler just because it helps me get that shape that we're looking for. Of course, you don't have to use a ruler. You could just freehand it. It's totally up to you. So up to that point and on the other side. Sometimes when I'm dealing with blocks like this, I want a little bit more detail, a little bit more quilting, so I'm going to add another one of those lines. Except I'm going to travel along the edge just a bit to separate them, and then quilt out to that point and onto the other side. And then since this design returns to the starting point, if I want, I can stitch around that area to flatten it out. But again, totally up to you. Of course, this is totally optional. You could leave it at one line, or shoot, you could leave it unquilted if you want. Totally doesn't matter. And then you can see it's nice and simple, nothing too overly complex, but just a nice curvy, pointy look to that area. Sometimes when you're trying to use your rulers in a certain area, you might find they don't always fit perfectly, but that doesn't mean you can't still use them. The pink arcs on this panel are not the exact same curve as the smiley ruler, but we're still going to make it work so we can use a ruler and get some nice smooth curves. Of course, if you're not using a ruler, you know the drill. You can freehand it if you'd like, or mark them out and quilt along the line. It's totally up to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to position Smiley and just quilt along that curve to the middle point. Then just change your ruler's position and quilt the other way. It's not going to give me a smooth curve, it's going to give me a point, but that's okay. There's actually a point in my area, so it actually works out perfect. And I love how you still have that nice curvy yet pointy echo that matches that area perfectly. And for those of you that want something a little bit more complex, a little bit more detail, you can actually fill in between those echo lines with a different design, like circles or even some tiny wishbones. Of course, this is definitely going to take longer, it's going to be more dense quilting, so you have to decide for yourself if you like the way that looks. Now this is definitely going to give your mandala panel a little bit of a wow factor, a little bit more custom type quilting. But if you want to add a little bit more detail, or you want to experiment with some other designs, you can actually treat this just as you would a sashing or a thinner border. One particular skill that I have that I'm super proud of is I can fit a feather anywhere. So if you want to add a curvy feather detail, I can just quilt a portion of the feather using the edges of one of these as a spine. It's a fun, easy way to practice those petals without committing to quilting a feather over your whole area. You can quilt your petals all the same direction so that they kind of wrap around, or you can make them come to a point if you want to draw attention to that area. And I think that one is the one I'm going to do. So starting from one edge, I'm going to quilt that first petal that extends out and touches the edge, and then travel back and back in. And I'm going to repeat doing that, filling in this half of that area. Now once I have that side done, I'm going to need to travel so I can do the other side. Since this particular type of feather builds off of the bottom, I need to get down there to start quilting it. Since this design incorporates traveling and stitching in the seam and working in both directions, it can be a little bit trickier. So this is going to be best suited for those of you that feel a little bit comfortable with your machine quilting but just want to learn different ways to apply these designs to your quilt. And then once I have that half filled, I can actually travel on out the first side and get back to where I started from. So again, I'm incorporating that traveling to help me maneuver my way around the area. However, it's totally up to you. You don't have to do that. But however you work your way around the area, when you're done, you have a beautiful, curvy, feathery looking design in your mandala. If you like the idea of quilting the feathers in your mandala panel, but you don't necessarily want them to face each other or have to worry about traveling to maneuver your way around, you can quilt them all in the same direction. And that's actually a perfect way to handle some of these pink arcs in the panel. And what's really neat is if I do that in all the pink sections, I'm going to get this secondary pattern where they look like they're kind of wrapping around. So again, perfect for those of you that want to quilt feathers without committing to doing a whole big feather, or just want to add a little bit more elegant detail to your quilt. And I'm just extending those petals out to the edge, making sure it fills the area as much as possible, and moving on. All these different rings on your mandala panel are about the same width, so you can kind of mix and match which designs you put where. Now in this white area, let's do something a little different. Instead of quilting those feathers, let's do some wishbone. Now you might think of wishbone and ribbon candy as more of a sashing design or a thinner border design, but it works great in areas like this. But we're going to see something a little tricky with it in that we're wrapping it around a very gentle corner. So this is really good practice for those of you that want to learn how to use this design in different areas. It's actually not as hard as it sounds, so let me show you how it goes. First, let's talk about just quilting the wishbone. I'm going to start from one edge of my area and quilt a line that angles towards the other side. But before I reach that edge, I'm going to loop and angle back the other direction until I get something like this, kind of like a little, wishbone. And then once I get close to the edge of that area, I'm going to loop around and go back the other direction. So I'm kind of going from side to side, quilting those loops and angling away. It really doesn't matter how big your loops are or how little they are. I am trying, however, to keep those diagonal lines at the same angle. And that's going to help me kind of progress through this design the way I want to go. I'm going to keep doing that, working my way through that area, but I have to handle the curve of this area a little differently. I'm going to quilt those wishbones so that those loops are a little bit closer together at the inner side of that area and a little bit further apart on the outer side. So kind of thinking like if I were to take that long wishbone and kind of bend it, some of them would be closer together and some would be stretched out a little bit. Don't overthink this. It doesn't have to be measured out or anything. Just kind of finagle it until you get around that corner and then you can go back to quilting them normally. If this seems a little bit tricky, don't worry. I've put together some downloadable quilting diagrams that will show you exactly what this looks like, and you can practice drawing over them over and over again until you get the hang of it, and then you can try putting it on your panel. Now, while it might be a little tricky to quilt it around that curve, the result is this design that looks like it's wrapping around, and it looks really cool. So give it a try. I promise it's not going to be that bad. Now, one thing I want to point out is I'm using a dark gray thread color, so you can really see what I'm doing in all the areas of this mandala panel. But if you bought the coordinating thread collection for the panel, go ahead and use the taffy color thread in the orange and the red and the pink, and in the background area, you can use your white thread. Unless you're feeling a little brave, you can use that contrasting color there too. It'll look really, really nice. Now this idea of taking those wishbones and curving them around an area is something that we can also apply to ribbon candy. The ribbon candy design is great for this type of area because it has a nice curvy round look, and it's actually pretty easy to quilt once you get the hang of it. So I'm just going to quilt the ribbon candy within this area, and I'm going to start from one edge, quilting a line that curves out and back, kind of like a backwards S, and then quilting that same shape but mirror imaging it. Now as I'm working through this area, quilting that ribbon candy, going from side to side, I'm going to approach the curve of the area the same way I did with the wishbone. As I get into that area, the part of the ribbon candy that's closer to the inside of the curve are going to be a little bit smaller, and the part of the ribbon candy that's closer to the outside of the curve are going to be a little bit bigger. And then once you turn that corner, you can just move on and finish quilting that area. So there you can see that ribbon candy, as it gets to that outer curve, is a little bit wider, and the ones on the inner curve are a little bit closer together, and that's just what helps it turn the corner and fill in that area perfectly. Now as you're quilting your mandala panel, you can come up with your own design options as well. Think of any design that works great in a sashing or a thinner border, and it's going to be perfect for this area. Whether that's the wishbones and the ribbon candy we saw, or even serpentine lines. But if you're a little bit newer to machine quilting and you're not comfortable with those designs, you can just add a couple of echo lines to fill in the area and move on. Well, now that we've seen some options for the arcs of our mandala panel, let's start focusing in on these red portions. Not only are they kind of curvy, kind of pointy, it's an irregular kind of weird shape that's going to be perfect for practicing fitting our designs in different areas. First up, let's see that plume feather again. When I'm picking out designs for quilts that I'm working on, I like to use the same designs in a couple of different ways throughout the quilt. Not only does it make the decision making a little bit easier, but it also gives the quilting a little bit of continuity. So using the plume feather in the center of the mandala means that I might also use it in other areas, such as this red portion. And just like we've already seen with that plume feather, it fits irregular areas, it gives it a nice texture. It's just a really fun design to quilt. Just like we saw last week, I'm going to start by quilting the spine of that feather, a nice curvy line that ends in a swirl. Then I'm going to quilt out of that swirl, coming out to a point, and then start quilting those plumes or those ferns down one side of my feather. I'm really going to extend it out to that edge, trying to fill up that space as much as possible and keep working my way until I filled in that whole side. And then once I have that first half of my plume feather, I'm going to do the same on the other side, just adding a little echo line that takes me up to the point, and then doing the same, quilting those serpentine kind of fern-shaped lines along the edge, filling in that area. And then when I'm done, I have that curvy, pointy plume feather that really fits that weird shape perfectly. In this particular example, I'm not even paying any attention to the design on the fabric or the detail. I'm just filling in that whole shape using the outside edge as my guide. But if you want to add a little bit more detail, make it look a little more custom, we can use some echoing to go around some of the details that's in the fabric. So for instance, this adorable little teardrop in here and a little bit of detail on the side, I'm actually going to use that as a guide for my quilting. What's nice about this is that the design is already there on the fabric. You're just quilting along the lines and echoing the shape. So it's kind of more mindless than the plume feather and a little bit easier, but it still is impactful. And if I don't want the quilting to be too crazy or too over the top, I'm just going to echo that shape inside and out until that whole area is filled in. And then, just for funsies, I'm going to go around the details on the side. And what's really nice is I have the quilting that kind of enhances the shape. It's nice and easy, and it just proves that you don't have to do difficult stuff over the whole quilt for it to look good. Now, let's try a different option on the long arm. You can kind of combine the two, use a little bit of echoing and use a little bit of filler designs to create a more intricate look. So just as I did it last time, I'm going to stitch along that edge of the area, and except this time, instead of echoing inside of it, I'm going to fill it in with another design. Now I'm going to use Pebbles because I like that pop of dense texture and because it's not a huge area to fill in, but you could use any filler, a meander, a swirl, just whatever it takes to fill it in and move on. The trick here though is that I'm going to try to end up where I started. So I'm going to work my way along one side and then come back trying to get as close as I can to my original start point. All right, let's continue working through our panel. We have one more main area to focus on, and that's this kind of background clamshell shape. Sometimes when I'm trying to decide how I'm going to quilt an area, I try to think of different ways to approach it, or what's a design that isn't normally known for that particular type of area. And for this one, I think I'm going to try a little bit of continuous curve. Now, continuous curve is something we normally see in blocks, right? It curves from point to give it a nice curvy motif look. But in this one, I'm going to use registration marks to quilt those curves. And what's nice is it's going to move me from one side to the other, so I could continue on quilting my next area if I wanted to. So I'm going to start from one side. I'm going to quilt a line that curves to that point. And then I'm going to kind of focus about halfway through right here. And out and back. And I'm going to keep doing that until I work my way around that whole area. And then continue on the other side. And what's really fun about this is it's going to give it a little bit of an unexpected look, and you can actually do it without marking, just kind of eyeballing where you want those points to go. And you can customize it and make it as complex or as easy as you want. Add more curves, quilt fewer curves, it's totally up to you. Just kind of find that sweet spot where you like how it looks. And then once you're done quilting, you can remove those marked lines and you have that nice, adorable detail right there. Another option for this area is to incorporate a little bit of echoing and some filler to give it that pop of texture. And of course, you can leave that echo line out if you prefer, but I do love how it accentuates that shape and makes the area a little bit smaller to fill in. And when it comes to filler, this is the opportunity for you to pick a design that's easy for you to quilt, that's nice and mindless, gives you a second to kind of relax as you're working through your panel. So anything that you feel comfortable quilting. I'm going to use swirls because that's my go-to design, but of course you can pick anything. And I know I've already said this in the video, but it's important to reiterate. I'm using this dark gray thread so that you can see what I'm doing. For those of you that are quilting along with me on the panel, you're going to want to use the yellow or the white. Or if you're feeling brave, you can actually use the taffy color in here as well. It just depends on how much contrast you want and how much you want that quilting to show up. Now I know this might seem like a lot of options, a lot of choices, but the thing to remember is that you're going to find the designs that you like and quilt them on your mandala. So don't be overwhelmed with the options. Just think of it as a sampler platter for you to pick from. Now for this last quilting design option for this area, we're going to incorporate a little bit of a focal, curvy, pointy shape to really draw attention to that area. And that one, I'm going to show you how to quilt it on the long arm. We're going to incorporate a little bit of taj to create a focal element to fill in around. Basically, I'm going to position my ruler and quilt along the inside so that I have that pointy arc shape that's centered on my yellow point. So I'm going to position my machine first where I need it to go. Then I'm going to position my ruler and just quilt along the inside of that cutout. Of course, if you don't have the taj ruler or if you don't feel comfortable quilting with your ruler, you could just mark this out and freehand it. Once I have that shape, I'm going to go ahead and echo it just to help build it up a little bit. So travel along the edge a bit and then just echo to the other side. Now that I have that part quilted, I can add whatever I want in here. I could quilt my ribbon candy so that it wraps around. I could use a different filler. Basically just something in here to give it nice texture so that my arc stands out. Once you decide how you're going to quilt your areas, then it's time to decide how you're going to transfer from one to the other. And in that instance, I'm going to use traveling to help move me to my next section so I can fill it in. And from there, I can quilt that little section however I want. And any cutout ruler will work for this. If you have a circle or a more pointy shape, you can just use anything that will give you a template to follow. All right, now it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel I designed for this challenge, fill in this whole area around the center with the designs of your choice. You can use the designs I've shown in the video, or you can come up with your own. I've also put together some free downloadable quilting diagrams that will show you how to create these designs. I really hope you'll take advantage of them because I think you're going to find them really helpful when you go to start quilting your panel. And if you need a little bit of extra help, you can check out the expanded resource PDF I put together. It has even more pictures and even more diagrams. To find a link to both of those, just click the link in the description box below. So I hope so far you are enjoying this free motion challenge quilting along. I'm going to be back next week with the next video in the challenge where we start to tackle the blue areas of our panel. Until then, everybody, happy quilting!